What do you hear? What do you say?
You're back. Kudos to you. You didn't get scared away like half the other people who watched the first part. And if you're not, and it's your first time hearing about GURPS, what are you doing here? You're skipping chapters. Stop that. Get out of here and watch the first part. Or get started reading GURPS Basic. I'll be here once you do. In the last part, you saw me babble on about design philosophies and list off stat lines and rules. While you've probably noticed that this part is longer, there's actually less rules I'll be going over. The key to learning combat is less about reading rules and more about absorbing the flow of the game. You have to actually play to gain this understanding. And since I can't upload a game of GURPS into your brains yet, I'll do the next best thing and be demonstrating some mock combats as we go along. I won't just stick to basic this time too. I'll be mixing in some rules from other books that I know will be useful for you down the line. So grab your dueling halberds and make sure you put on a combat hardsuit as we tackle the beast that is GURPS combat. Something that we need to learn before we get into the active weapons and maneuvers is how your character's body, stats, and condition affect combat. Because believe me, almost everything can count for something if you look hard enough and tailor your build in the right way. You don't have to argue with the GM to gain an extra die or a brief house rule while they grumble under their breath. This stuff is ingrained in the rules. And for the GMs, that door of consequences and tactical advantages swings both ways. So let's get into it by starting with something that might just have been the original selling point of GURPS for you: hit locations. Let me just cut to the chase. Yes, you can actually target, cripple, and even sever any limb you please. It doesn't require any special class or prerequisite to target a limb with an attack, just an added penalty to your roll. Of course, there's a few cases where certain targets don't make sense. You can't exactly hit someone's face if they're not looking in your direction, and you can't target someone's eye with the blade of a great axe. GURPS assumes that without actively choosing a target, you're either aiming for the torso or going against the random hit locations table. So choosing a location is a part of your attack. You just pick your spot and try your luck. So let's look at each hit location, going from top to bottom. I don't have to tell you twice that getting hit in the head is bad. There's kind of a wealth of information on how much our squishy brain matter hates being moved.
I'm very few.
There may not be any CTE rules in GURPS, but it certainly does emphasize how resounding headshots can be in combat. Targeting the skull means taking a -7 penalty from your roll. It's steep, but fair considering the consequences. The skull also has a damage resistance of 2. As a refresher, this value is what you have to break through to see how much damage the target takes. The skull has a wounding modifier of ×4, which means any damage that breaks through gets multiplied by 4 instead of their usual modifier. This is already rough, but in addition to that, any damage dealt to the skull prompts a knockdown roll, which I went over in the last part. If you take a major wound, it's made at -10. Our next spot to target is the eye. This one's even more dangerous to get hit in, but also even more difficult to target than the skull. Targeting the eye is a -9 penalty, but you also have the same traits as if you hit the skull without the damage resistance you get from it. If you're dealt more than 1/10 of your HP in a single hit there, that eye is lost. The main catch is that it can only be targeted by attacks that deal piercing or tight beam burning damage. Next, let's move on to the face. Targeting this spot gives you a -5 to your roll, and is mainly done for the added pain modifiers. Like the skull, you roll against health to see if you're knocked down whenever you're hit here. But if you're dealt a major wound, you have a -5 to that roll instead. Let's move down to the neck. This one also has a -5 to target it. There's a few damage types that get wounding bonuses from targeting here, but I'll get more into those later. It says that if the GM feels nice enough, they should let an attack that kills an enemy to decapitate it. But I personally prefer a major wound that kills it, as that constitutes you dealing more damage to actually chop the head. Next, we've got the vitals. It's a misconception that it's only the heart. It actually includes the lungs, kidneys, and other juicy places. The vitals are an easy spot to target, being only a -3 to target them. However, do consider that any armor covering the torso will also be covering the vitals, and only tight beam burning and piercing attacks are able to target them. Now we've got the limbs to take care of. First is the arms and the legs. These aren't the same hit location. They just share a similar profile for hit points and penalties. The arms and legs have a -2 to target them, and in order to deal a crippling blow, you need to have dealt damage over half of their total hit points in one strike. This is a solid place to target, having a shallow penalty compared to the rest of the hit locations, not to mention the effects of crippling an arm or a leg. Speaking of which, let's get into that. If your arm is crippled, you straight up drop anything you're holding, unless if it's with 2 hands, then you get a dexterity roll to see if your other hand manages to keep its grasp. This isn't like Tarkov where your aim gets all wobbly. You've temporarily gained a disadvantage. There's a few more rules in place for crippling attacks, and especially what constitutes limbs being removed that I'll cover a bit later. Crippling a leg means you fall down. You're not able to stand unassisted without both usable legs, so you'll only be able to crawl if you want to get around. Next, let's move on to the hands and feet. These have a penalty of -4, with the added advantage of having a smaller amount of damage required to cripple them. That's only 1/3 of your total HP instead of 1/2, so you'll generally have a better time chopping those off than with the arms and legs. With a crippled hand or foot, you have the same effects as I mentioned before, either not being able to stand or not being able to hold anything, with a few exceptions due to the fact that you can technically still move the rest of your limb. One thing about the limbs is that any large or huge piercing attacks have their wounding modifiers reduced to 1. Don't think I forgot about the last core hit location, the groin. Much like the face, you target the groin for the resounding pain penalties applied to your target. Of course, this depends on if you've got more vulnerable equipment down there. Targeting here only nets you a -3 penalty, with a doubled shock penalty as well as a -5 to knockdown rolls. Yes, kicking your enemies in the balls is an apt strategy for your games. These are all of the core hit locations that Basic gives you, but there are other modules that expand the total hit locations, like Martial Arts. There, it details places like the spine, or even arteries that each have their own unique effects. These are the hit locations for an average person, but GURPS is supposed to encompass all character types, right? Well, that's where the different hit tables come in. Trust me on this, it covers everything, from dragons to wyverns to octopuses, everything. In regards to adding or subtracting from the basic human body type, advantages that omit certain body parts just mean that they can't be targeted or damaged. It doesn't necessarily mean that they don't exist per se. For the case of disadvantages, they also can't be targeted, but they just aren't there and can't be used for their given purpose. Also, just one last thing about targeted attacks. If your target has a limb that can be crippled and it's dealt a crippling blow, that target needs to roll against health to see how severe the damage is. This isn't the major wound check, it's a different roll that can genuinely make or break a character's survivability. If you succeed on this roll, then the wound is just temporary. Once you're back to full HP, the negative effects will go away. Treat it as a minor fracture or severe swelling. If you fail this roll, then it's bad news. After combat, you need to roll 1d to see how many months it takes to heal. If you have a physician helping you, they can subtract from this depending on the TL, but it can never be below 1. If you critically fail it, then it loses its use for good. You permanently have that disadvantage now. Yet another reminder to keep those health scores high, guys. Now let's get into an example of these rules in play. We've got two combatants that have been in a harsh back and forth thus far, and our heroic player wishes to end it in one blow. He's got a skill of 18 in his broadsword, and for the sake of simplicity, let's say the enemy can't defend right now. The enemy currently has 20 hit points, and the player wants to question him later, so he opts to go for a non-lethal route of attack. His target being the hand that's holding the weapon in order to disarm him. He only needs to deal 7 damage in order to cripple it and thus get the weapon out of his control. As we know, the hand has a -4 penalty to target it, and as such, that will reduce his effective skill to 14. So he steps forward and presses his attack. He rolls a 12 and is successful in landing a blow to his opponent's hand. He deals 10 total damage with his attack, triggering a crippling blow, and thus a major wound as well. He saves on the major wound check, but his weapon has fallen to the ground as well as his pride. Our player has now successfully non-lethally taken care of his enemy, and the game moves onward. Now let's get into some of the lovely stuff regarding the battle maps, how you measure your boards, and how your characters can maneuver around. First off, GURPS is an American system, so it uses the imperial modes of measurement. GURPS uses hexes to gauge distance and to embody a character's space on the board. If you're used to squares, you better get out of that habit, because the hex grid is utilized in a lot of interesting and vital ways for combat balance. For instance, let's get into your character's arc of vision. If you've seen GURPS being played on Foundry, then you may have seen this before. Your character has 3 front-facing hexes that display your direct point of vision, 2 side-facing hexes that are your blind spots, and 1 back hex that is right behind you. All of these represent your periphery and what you can see in-game. If you take the peripheral vision advantage, those side hexes open up, and if you take 360-degree vision, you have no back hex. Vision cones are mainly why keeping track of where you're facing is important to game balance, as there's useful ways to exploit an enemy's defense by attacking from less opportune angles. In addition to that, the way they move is also affected by it. For instance, if you want to just turtle yourself and strafe backwards, you'll be moving half as fast as someone who just moved in the direction of their front hexes. Never mind about tactical movement, that's a rabbit hole for another time. Let's instead get into the various postures your characters can get into and what their uses can be. This isn't just about how to know what happens when you get knocked prone. There's a genuine strategy for certain postures, such as using cover and hiding from potential observers. They mainly affect 4 things about a character's abilities: whether or not they can be targeted in the torso, groin, or legs, how well they can attack or defend, and how far they can move. The default posture for characters that can stand is the standing posture. This comes with all of the basic capabilities the game gives you. There's nothing special about this one. Now let's move on to crouching. This one's a bit different than the rest of the postures, as there's a bit more flexibility as to when you can transition from standing to crouching in combat, speaking as you're just bending your knees and hunching your spine. A crouching character has a -2 to target it, but has a -2 to melee attacks as well. They move 2/3 as fast as they would normally. This is generally good for when you're looking to bounce in between cover while maintaining a somewhat high movement speed. The next posture we have to go over is kneeling, as this is slightly different than crouching, but you might find yourself using it more often. I say this because it's actually the midpoint from getting up if you've fallen on the ground and are trying to get back up to standing. You're a bit closer to the ground than with crouching, but with a similar silhouette, which means you have less options for movement. The modifiers are the same as crouching, but with a -2 to active defenses, and you move 1/3 as fast instead. Next is the crawling posture. This is mainly used for when you need to actively move when you're lying down, whether it be for the sake of cover or for a crippled leg. You're at a -4 to attack and a -3 to defend, with a -2 to target you, and moving at 1/3 of your normal speed. Now let's move on to sitting. This may seem like a dumb position to have, but think about how many times your characters are going to have a bite to eat and get jumped while doing so. This position has a -2 to attack, defend, and be targeted, with a movement speed of 0. You're kind of just sitting there. Now for our last position, lying down. This is the most compromising position, as you're at a -4 to attack, -3 to defend, and are moving at only 1 yard per second. Falling down isn't great. You still get the -2 to be targeted, but I'd say it's best to exit this position as soon as possible. Let's put what you've learned into use again, this time on a distant rocky planet far away in the star system. Our player notices something ahead in his cone of vision. He's been warned about hijacked mining bots going rampant in this abandoned area, and sees one on the horizon. They're primed to kill any organic targets. These robots are armed with lasers, so it's best to stay out of the way. Our character is going to drop down into the lying down posture to hopefully make it more difficult to attack him. Because of this, any onlookers are now going to have a ranged penalty of -2 in addition to anything else. As predicted, the robot is going to fire upon the character with a potentially lethal laser beam, but misses its attack due to the penalties it suffers. Now let's move on from that and talk for a brief moment about how the environment affects play, namely about darkness. I'm zeroing in on this part of the environment in particular because I know all of you are just going to be running dungeon fantasy games, regardless of how many settings you can run, and you can bet one thing for certain, dungeons can get dark. So, the general ambient light of an area is measured between 2 spectrums, regular daylight and pitch darkness. As you go further into darkness, the more difficult and thus penalized actions requiring your eyes become. This results in penalties maxing out at -10 for places like a pitch black cave with not a single source of light. How dark a given area is typically depends on the GM's discretion, and this is where you get a rare critique of GURPS from me. Because while they do mention what constitutes certain types of darkness, they really don't talk much about how light sources taper off, and if they do, it's in other books when it really should be in basic. Well, allow me to introduce a really great fan tool by u/Fountain Coiffer, which combines most mentions of light across the books into a neat grid of how to view darkness and light sources. With this, you're able to see the gradients that the books lay out for you in visual form. This is your reminder to pack a torch, NVGs, or pick up night vision in character creation. Now let's tie these all together into one final exhibit to show what you've learned in play. This exhibit begins with 2 adventurers delving into a forgotten dungeon, previously enjoying the benefits of its magical lanterns lighting their way. They come across a hallway headed straight forward into darkness, with a door at the end of the tunnel. The GM tells them that this corridor gets as dark as a -6 penalty to vision. With this penalty in mind, the GM also mentions that the door has markings in an ancient language that player 1 has points in. However, he can't read it from this distance. Due to him having curious, he rushes to investigate. He fails his sense roll, and before he knows it, he's been struck with 6 impaling damage to his leg. The GM rolled a 13 on the random hit location table due to this arrow being shot out of a trap. Since player 1 has only 11 hit points, this attack both cripples his leg and deals a major wound. While he saves on his health roll for the major wound, he still can't walk due to his crippled leg. He also thankfully saved on his other health roll for the severity of the injury, so it will only last until he's fully healed. Player 2 has 3 levels of night vision, negating some of the darkness penalties, and heads to player 1's aid. She passes her sense roll as she approaches, noticing a single slit in the wall where an arrow would have released. She then changes her posture to kneeling to reach his body, and then begins to cast a spell to heal his injuries. With a successful skill roll, her spell works, as player 1's missing hit points are now fully restored. She only loses 3 out of her 14 FP to cast the spell, so she's good to go after the fact. While he previously had acquired the lame disadvantage due to his injury, the effects are now reversed, and he's able to exit the lying down posture. Player 1 thanks player 2 for her help, and they then move onwards.
Hey guys, it is Current Fed here. Thanks again for tuning in. Right now, the next part's in process. The more I'm working this thing, it gets longer and longer, I swear. But I promise it's going to be out in 2 weeks for your viewing pleasure. Stay GURPing, guys.